You're listening to Ghostumentary Scary Short Stories, original pieces updated throughout the week.
The Boy in the Window. Libby sat quietly in Tony's backyard, clutching her drink while the low hum of conversation buzzed around her. The laughter and chatter of 20 others at the party barely registered. She had always been a bit of an outsider at gatherings like this. She liked Tony well enough, but most of these people were strangers. The backyard was small, but Tony had transformed it into a lush garden filled with tomatoes, hot peppers, and vines that twisted over everything. Libby found herself more interested in the plants than in joining the group's lively conversation about binge-worthy TV shows. Across the alley, her eyes drifted to an old garage. Its second story jutted out, casting a long shadow across the alleyway. The building was ancient, like Tony's house, over 100 years old. A single grimy window faced the yard. The glass cracked and clouded with age. Libby couldn't help but stare at it, a strange feeling stirring inside her. It was as if the window was watching her, calling to her in some way. She blinked, pulling her attention back to the people around her. They were deep into a debate about the latest streaming series, their voices rising and falling in an almost musical rhythm. She tried to engage, nodding along as someone recommended a true crime docuseries. But her focus slipped. There it was again, movement in the window. Her heart skipped a beat. She snapped her head up to look. But the window was empty. A chill prickled the back of her neck. She had been sure she saw something, or someone, moving behind the glass. The alley was too quiet, and the house connected to the garage had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember. Tony had mentioned it earlier. No one had lived there in years. Maybe even decades. Libby tried to shake it off, focusing back on the group, but then she saw it again, a flicker of motion in the upstairs window. This time, when she looked, a boy was staring down at her, his pale face pressed against the dirty pane. His sunken eyes locked on hers. His clothing was odd, old-fashioned, as if he had stepped out of a time long past. He looked sickly, almost ghostly, and his small hand rested on the window, as if he was trying to reach for her. Libby's blood ran cold. She felt rooted to her chair. The group around her kept talking, oblivious to what was happening just across the alley. Slowly, she managed to turn to Tony, who was laughing at something someone had said. "Tony," she whispered, her voice shaky. Do you see that boy in the window?" Tony raised an eyebrow, glancing toward the garage. "What boy?" "There's nothing over there." Libby. She looked again, and sure enough, the boy was gone. The window was just as it had been before, dirty, cracked, and empty. But she had seen him. She knew she had. Her heart pounded in her chest. Something was very wrong. She turned back to the group, trying to focus, trying to convince herself it was nothing, just her imagination. But before long, the boy reappeared. This time, he wasn't alone. A woman stood behind him, her face twisted in fury. She had the same ghostly appearance as the boy, her dark dress hanging off her gaunt frame. The boy looked terrified, his eyes pleading with Libby for help. The woman's bony hand gripped his shoulder, pulling him back into the darkness of the room behind them. Then, they vanished. Libby shot up from her seat. She couldn't ignore it anymore. She had to help him, help them. Without thinking, she slipped out of the backyard, moving through the narrow alley toward the abandoned garage. The rest of the party continued on without noticing her absence, their laughter and conversation fading into the background as her pulse thrummed in her ears. The stairs leading up to the second floor of the garage were old, creaky, and covered in dirt. Libby hesitated, feeling a strange sense of foreboding as she placed her foot on the first step. Tony had said no one had been in this house for years, maybe ever. She felt like she was trespassing in a place that time had forgotten. With each step, the air grew colder, her breath came out in shaky puffs, and the world around her seemed to quiet. The noise of the party was now nothing but a distant murmur, as though she had crossed into another realm entirely. When she reached the top of the stairs, she saw the door was slightly ajar, but when she pushed, it wouldn't budge. Libby shoved against it with all her strength, but it stayed stubbornly closed. Just when she was ready to give up, the handle turned on its own, and the door creaked open. She stepped inside, her body trembling. The room was even darker than she'd imagined. Cobwebs hung thick in the corners, and the faint light from the window barely pierced the gloom. She whispered, "Hello, little boy?" Her voice was small, almost swallowed by the eerie silence. No response. She walked toward the window where the boy had been, looking down at the garden party below. She could see everyone still enjoying themselves, completely unaware of her absence. No one noticed her up here, alone in the dark. She wondered what this room had been 100 years ago. Could that boy have been trapped here, looking out just as he had tonight? Then she heard it, a soft rustling behind her. She turned and froze. The boy was there, standing at the far end of the room, the same look of desperation on his face, and behind him, the woman, her face twisted into a mask of rage, her eyes boring into Libby with a hatred that made her blood run cold. They began moving toward her, their feet not touching the ground. Floating, their ghostly forms were pale and translucent, but their presence felt real, overwhelmingly real. Libby was paralyzed with fear as they picked up speed. Rushing toward her, she threw her arms up in a futile attempt to protect herself. But instead of colliding with her, they passed through her. The sensation was icy, like death itself had brushed against her. She gasped, turning back toward the window just in time to see them vanish into the night, her heart still pounding. Libby made a break for the door. She grabbed the handle, but her hand passed right through it, as though it wasn't there. Panic set in. She hit the door, pulled at it, but it wouldn't move. Her hands went through the wood as if it were made of smoke. She screamed for help, but no sound came out. She pounded on the window, waving desperately at the partygoers below. No one could see her. No one, except the boy and the woman. They stood in the garden now, looking up at her with twisted smiles, as if they were pleased with what they had done. Libby's heart sank as she realized the terrible truth. She had set them free, and now she was trapped, just like they had been, for 100 years, maybe more.
Looking for more scary tales? Subscribe to our podcast and visit ghostumentary.com. Let us know what you think or share with us your scary tales. We might just make a new story from it.